Reformed Church.
Today is actually going to be a little bit unique in the sense that I don't actually need this TV or the temple today, because we're actually going to be talking about the builder of the temple in particular today. And then from here on out, we will be going over the different aspects of the temple. Last week, in part 1, we just introduced what is the temple, like that, just the very basics. Again, as I've been telling you guys, with the sort of format and the way that I've been going through different series, I just don't want anyone to sort of be left out if you haven't heard other things. So I'm at least to some degree trying to start really from like the very beginning. So we did start at the beginning being, what is the temple? What does that mean? What is it symbolic of? Obviously, you could probably gather that from the title anyway. We're the temple. So anyway, that is what the first part was about. Our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit and all of that. We did go over a lot of things too, just to correct, because anyone in the church will pretty much acknowledge the fact that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, we're the temple of God, but they also do apply the term temple to other things as well, and church buildings, and so we went over some of that as well. And Solomon is the one that built the temple. Obviously, the way that you see it here is, generally speaking, as I was telling you last week, proportional and stuff to the way it really did look. There are certain things that, I don't know how the pillars, the elements of the pillars exactly looked, but at least the pillars, like represented here, for instance, they have the elements that are named in the Bible are there. So, generally speaking, what you're looking at is somewhat of a representation of it. And we will go over in the future how, for instance, this part of the temple is the head of the temple. This is the belly of the temple. These are the legs of the temple. We will go over sort of, it's almost like it's like a human anatomy look to it within, to a certain degree. She's got a veil over her face. The two cherubim are the two eyes with the law between the eyes, where the Ark of the Covenant containing the two tablets were between the eyes. There's a lot of really cool stuff we'll go over. But this represents the church as a whole. And Solomon, the builder of the temple, is really what we're going to be talking about today. So one thing I do want to point out, though, just as a matter of clarification from last week, is I don't want to sort of belabor this point, but I mentioned how sometimes even people, when referring to 1 Corinthians 3, and how they talk about how every man's work is going to be tested by fire or with fire in the last day when Jesus comes back, and what they think that means, because it talks about like these building blocks, and it says that Paul, as a wise master builder, how he built, and then it says, but every man's work is going to be tested with fire, whether it's gold, silver, or wood, hay, and stubble. And anyway, I'm not really going to do a teaching on that right now, but I did mention last week that the building and the work that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 3 that's going to be tested with fire are actually people. The building blocks that he talks about there are people being built up into the temple. The Bible actually says, it says that everybody will be salted with fire. Everybody will be tested with fire. And there is a, I'm not going to get into the details of that, but essentially, everybody's going to be tested as to whether you're a sheep or a goat, as to whether you're saved or unsaved, whether you've believed on Jesus or whether you won't. But it's not, when Paul says that his work was going to be tested with fire in the last day, his work that he's referring to is the temple of God, us, the people that are being added. That was his work. He starts out, if you want to just look at it just super quick, 1 Corinthians 3, he starts out this whole thing where we're told that our works are going to be shown to us in the last day, and that, they're going to be tested and we're going to be rewarded according to our good deeds. 1 Corinthians 3:9 in the New King James Version. I'm going to switch translations probably a few times, but Paul opens up the whole thing. He opens up that whole concept of every man's work is going to be tested by saying, for we are God's fellow workers. And what is Paul working on, though? See, because he says he's a worker. And then later on, he says that his work would be tested. But what is he working on? He says, and you are God's field. He is one sort of avenue of symbolism there. And then he says, you are God's building. So the thing that he's building, the gold, the silver, the wood, hay, and the stubble that's going to be tested in the last day, those are building blocks he's referring to. And it's like, we assume that the building blocks, Paul's work that's going to be tested in the last day to see if it's approved or not, is his good deeds. But it's funny, he opens the thing up by saying, you are God's building. He says, we're the workers, and you're the building. And yet somehow we see the building blocks that are going to be tested in the last day and say that they're Paul's good deeds. Meanwhile, he says that they're the people themselves are the ones that he was attempting to build into the temple, and they would be tested in the last day. And so if you're interested in that whole concept, because I'm not going to teach on it right now, we have an article online called There Are No Rewards in Heaven for Your Good Deeds. It's a very clear title, so you know exactly what you're getting into. It's based on 1 Corinthians 3, and it explains that. So I won't go into it now, but again, he just says, you are God's building, and that's what we were addressing last week. So let me, let's kind of move on from this. So let's go to Hebrews 3:1. Hebrews 3:1 in the King James Version. Hebrews 3:1. It says, now that we know that we're the temple of God, and that when people get saved, it's called them being built up into the temple. It says, wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and the high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him that appointed him, as also Moses was faithful in all his house. For this man, referring to Jesus, was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, insomuch as he who has builded the house has more honor than the house. So this is saying that Jesus should be counted deserving of more glory than Moses is worthy of glory. It says, and he likens it to how a man that builds the house is deserving of more credit than the house itself. And he's comparing, if you didn't already catch that, Jesus as the builder and Moses as the house that Jesus was building. So here what you see, it's calling Jesus the builder. And this is what, again, we were talking about last week, that when people, to build someone into the temple, to build up the temple in the Bible, and there are even symbolism with building the tabernacle, and where people came and they gave for the service of the tabernacle and then built that, that structure, or that tent. This concept of building the temple up is just a symbol for adding people to the church. Whenever someone gets saved, they're like a living stone being added to the temple. And if you listen to our Last Days series, we went over this quite a lot. Actually, a lot of the Last Days, toward the end of the Last Days series, a lot of that is actually based on that principle that when Jesus actually finishes the temple, there's a particular number of his elect that he's waiting for. And when he reaches the full number of people that are to be saved, not willing that any should perish, then that's when Jesus returns. So right now the temple is still not fully built. Like, we're parts of the temple. If we've received Jesus for ourselves, we are part of the God's temple. We're individual abodes, individual houses in the whole temple of God. But until the last of God's elect that he knows will receive him is added to his church, Jesus won't come back until then. This is actually why the Bible said that we can hasten his coming. We can actually cause Jesus to come back quicker, because as per usual, he's working on our schedule, right? Never say, well, it's all in God's timing when it comes to receiving from God. The Lord's timing for receiving from him is always today, because his sacrifice that he made 2,000 years ago was for sins forever. So even in David, as an Old Testament saint, he said, today is the day to enter his rest. So it's always God's time for us to receive. But God is working on our schedule. He's considering and being patient with us so that we can learn. And he is patient with us. He knows that it takes time to learn, but he wants us to learn, and he's working around our timing, how we are diligent to seek him and to get to know him and open our hearts to him for him to speak to us. And so that's the only reason why Jesus is coming back on a particular day. And just so you know, you're able to know that day. You'll be able to tell as a believer. You have the mind of Christ. You'll be able to tell the day, the hour, the second when Jesus is about to come back. You're able to know that. He does come as a thief in the night, but you're not a part of the night, as 1 Thessalonians, I believe it is, says. You're not a part of the night. You're a part of the day, which means you can see clearly. So he's not going to come as a thief to you. But all that said, though, Jesus is working around us, and he's waiting for people, his elect, to be added to his church. And until there's enough people built up in his temple to where he says, okay, I believe that the point is that the Lord would see, you could sort of take this as opinion, but I don't really see any other way to explain this, that Jesus looks at the earth and says, okay, there's no one currently on the earth that would receive my salvation, and therefore, since all my elect are saved, my temple's finished, and then I'll come back. But if Jesus came back too early, there are people that would be elect that would receive him that just hadn't got a chance yet. And, you can read the parable of the wheat and the tares, and basically the wheat would get burnt up with the tares if he came back too soon. So anyway, the erection of his temple, the building of his temple is on our, time frame, right? The more we get to know Jesus, the more we get our feet washed, the more that we are prepared with the gospel, the more effective that makes us in ministering to other people, the more that other people get ministered to, the quicker Jesus comes back. That's actually how it works. He will come back when the headstone, when the top stone is laid, boom, last stone laid, then he can come back and he can destroy the present earth without destroying some of his elect with it. That's the whole concept. And again, we use that a lot in the last days. So anyway, I could read you more of this, but suffice it to say from this passage in Hebrews 3, Jesus is the builder. He's the one that's orchestrating this whole thing, right? He works through us. The Spirit of God works through us to speak to other people, to preach to other people. But Jesus is the one orchestrating the additions to his temple that he wants to finish in these last days, right? In our days, the Lord will lay the last stone, and then Jesus will come back, and then, no one will get sort of swept up with the ungodly at that point. In the name of talking about builders, we just read that Jesus is the builder, but if you look at Zechariah 4, before we actually read that, I'm going to mention a few things. It's Zechariah 4:6 that I'm going to end up, but just before we read that, it's important to note that the concept of being king and priest, you've probably heard that before. Revelation 5:10, for instance, you don't have to go there, but it talks about us being kings and priests to God. Kings, obviously, is referring to our authority over everything. Could mean a little bit more than that. And priest is referring to something that we'll probably talk about toward the end of the series. I don't have a full understanding of the priest aspect of it, but priest, at the very least, does include us adding people to the church. And we'll talk about that. But anyhow, the concept of being king and priest is a thing that is used for us in the Bible, but also used for Jesus, king and priest. Melchizedek, if you were to read Hebrews chapter 7, Melchizedek is someone who is used to be symbolic of Jesus in the book of Genesis, chapter 14. And Melchizedek is said to be a priest of the Most High God, and yet he's also called King of Salem, which means King of Peace. Actually, even Melchizedek, the name Melchizedek, I believe it's like a combination of the words like Melech, which means king, and Zedek, which means righteousness. And even his name means King of Righteousness. So you even see as a symbol of Jesus, Melchizedek being a symbol. He's both priest and he's a king, right? So the king and priest concept is pretty pervasive through the Bible for us and Jesus. Knowing that, though, if you read Zechariah 4, starting in verse 6, it says, and actually one more thing to note before we start reading. Zerubbabel and Joshua, the high priest, are two people that rebuilt the temple. Actually, when this particular temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed years and years later, while they were still in captivity, they began to rebuild the temple. The rebuilding of the temple also represents like the building of the church, same symbolism. And the builders, the people that were overseeing the building of the temple was Zerubbabel. He was a governor, and the governor of I guess of Israel. I don't know if it's a specific portion of Israel, but he was governor, and Joshua was high priest. And so you see that king and priest kind of concept, even with Zerubbabel and Joshua. They both represent Jesus in two different roles. Remember, Jesus is the builder of the temple, right? So Zerubbabel and Joshua building the temple up represent Jesus as king and priest, building his temple up in these last days, right? That's what it symbolizes. So here, when it talks about Zerubbabel, he's actually referring to Jesus here, okay? And it says in verse 6, then he answered and spake unto me in the King James Version, Not that God spoke to him in the King James Version, but we're reading the King James Version. Then he answered and spake unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. A lot of people quote that verse, but don't actually realize it's specifically referring to the building of his temple when God says that it would happen by his Spirit. Verse 7, it says, Who art thou, O great mountain, before Zerubbabel? Thou shalt become a plain, and he shall bring forth the headstone, or the top stone, thereof with shoutings, crying, Grace, grace unto it. Now, that top stone is referring to like the last stone. If you were to read the context, which I did teach on in the last days on this chapter, the context actually here, he's referring to the end of the age. He talks about the two witnesses just before this and just the verses previous to this, and he talks about, therefore, the finishing of the temple, which is what the two witnesses are called to do in the last days, is to finish the temple. And so, right off of that, right on the heels of that, he says that Zerubbabel, that Jesus would lay the headstone thereof, with shouts of grace, grace unto it. So he's saying that Jesus will finish the temple. And that's why in the next verse he says in verse 8, Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands shall also finish it. And you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. So the fact that he says, and his hands shall finish it, that's why it makes sense for him to be saying this in context of a last days type chapter, because he's referring to the finishing of the temple. But my point with this, though, is that Jesus, again, here is being referred to as the builder, as Zerubbabel and Joshua, the priest, that both king and priest, that Jesus would build his temple, he would begin building the temple, and his hands would also finish it. Jesus will see to it that every single person that is elect, that they are added to his temple, and when they're added to his temple, that's when he comes back. I won't go through this too because I just take up more time, but if you actually are interested, there is evidence of this also, this whole concept of Jesus, even with the two witnesses, there's something with that as well. In our Jacob and Esau timeline, in the Last Days series, that's actually where I talk about just one of the symbolic timelines in which you see the headstone being laid, at least it's symbolic of it, the headstone being laid right before Jesus comes back. We talked about that. Those timelines, though, are quite reliant on one another. So if you're going to read the timelines in the Last Days series, I would recommend watching all the videos. But anyway, you actually see when Jacob, it says, laid a stone at his head, and then he has the dream and everything. Right after, he says, this is the house of God. He calls the name Bethel, being house of God. And so, him laying down represents actually the temple, and then he laid a stone at his head, and that actually represents, that event right there represents just before Jesus comes back, where the headstone is laid, the top stone is laid, anyhow, so there's a lot more I could say about that. Let's go to 1 Chronicles 22. 1 Chronicles 22. So we know that Jesus is the builder, king and priest. He is the builder of the temple. He's the one that adds, who's adding people to the church. 1 Chronicles 22, though, verse 7, Solomon, obviously, in context, is the builder that we're talking about in the series. And it's going to be very important for us to understand Solomon, because Solomon is a picture of Jesus as well, because Solomon built the temple. The temple represents us. Solomon represents Jesus, who built the temple, who adds people to this temple. And knowing that that's true, I'm going to show you several verses that actually confirm Solomon as representing Jesus, which helps a whole lot, especially when reading Song of Solomon and stuff. But 1 Chronicles 22:7, King James Version, it says, And David said to Solomon, My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house unto the name of the Lord my God, but the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed blood abundantly, and have made great wars, and you shall not build a house unto my name, because you have shed much blood upon the earth in my sight. But behold, this is really a prophecy of Jesus here. I'll show you several reasons for why this is, in fact, a prophecy of Jesus. Verse 9, Behold, a son shall be born to thee. Now, you have to know Jesus came in the lineage of David. Jesus was not only in the lineage of David through Mary. Mary was a daughter. You can read about that in Luke 3. I believe it's Luke 3. That has the genealogy that From what I understand about that genealogy, it doesn't seem to be Mary's genealogy. It makes it almost look like it's Joseph's genealogy, but it is, in fact, Mary's. And also in Matthew 1, you see Joseph's genealogy. Now, granted, Jesus' birth had nothing to do with Joseph, but even Joseph's father was also, Jesus' earthly father was in the line of David as well. So when it says that a son shall be born unto you, God referring to David here, he's telling David a son will be born to you. This is actually a prophecy of Jesus. And check out what it says about Jesus here. Now, let's just pause for a second. I've said things like this before to people in the past, and they're like, well, what are you talking about? He's clearly talking about Solomon. But again, God can be saying two different things at the same time, especially the weightier thing that God is saying here is not that you're going to have a son named Solomon. The weightier thing that God's saying here, and furthermore, the reason why God would include this in Scripture is because it testifies of Jesus. So the weighty thing that God wants to see here, of course, you can take this as referring to Solomon in certain ways, but I'll show you why this is referring to Jesus in just a second. But for now, look at what it says about Jesus. It says, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies round about, for his name shall be Solomon. Just so you know, Solomon means peace. So when he says that he shall be a man of rest, and I'll give him rest from his enemies round about, for his name shall be Solomon, you can even almost hear in the name like Shalom, like Solomon, right? You can hear Shalom even in there. And so Solomon means peace. So he's going to be a man of rest. I'm going to give him rest from his enemies round about. His name will be Solomon. And I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. So, again, this is referring to Jesus here, and I'll show you the verse right after this. You know, let's just keep reading. I might as well show you right now. Verse 10, he shall build a house for my name, and he shall be my son, and I shall be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. And you know that there is a way that you can see that this is referring to Solomon. There's sort of a voice, a mouth, in which a symbolic way that this can be talking about Solomon. But there's the weightier layer here that God's trying to communicate is that he says that Solomon would build a house for him, and that his throne would be over Israel forever. Now, you know that obviously Solomon has already died. Solomon is clearly also not on the throne. They don't even have a monarchy in Israel anymore anyway. And so just the fact that he says that his throne would be over Israel forever is already a clue that, okay, there's something else going on in this passage besides just talking about Solomon. But clearly this is referring to Jesus. I'm going to show you another verse from the New Testament in just a second as well, that Jesus actually calls himself the greater Solomon. Okay, so I'll show you that in just 1 minute. But Solomon is a picture of Jesus because it's Jesus whose throne is obviously forever, who's a king forever. And that's who he's talking about here. So when he says in verse 9, referring to Solomon but symbolically to Jesus, that he would be a man of rest, it says that God would give Jesus rest from all his enemies round about, and referring to Jesus symbolically, that Jesus would give us peace and quietness in his days. Again, so just sort of bear with me on the evidence for Solomon being Jesus here. But it's important to understand, Solomon is the builder of the temple. As we go through this whole series, we will establish the fact that this temple, I mean, you can already see here, if this is the head, if this is the belly, and this is the legs, you already see, before I even go any further than that, that's obviously, if that's true, right? And I will prove to you that that's true. Again, the two eyes with the law between the eyes, just the same way that Deuteronomy commands that there be the law between our eyes and the veil over her face, and certain things that she can't see of what's already on the inside of her belly. There's a belly filled with gold, and then there's legs over here with a basin of water at her feet. So you see it's a person laying down, right? But a person what? A person laying down. And Solomon the builder is said to be the source of Israel's peace and quietness. So you can see sort of the camaraderie, if you want to say that, between the two elements here, where, okay, Solomon, the builder, is said to give peace and quietness unto Israel. And the temple that he builds looks like someone lying down. So you can clearly see what the symbolism here. If we're the temple, we're the ones that are actually receiving the rest and the peace and the quietness. And Solomon is Jesus, the builder, giving that peace and that rest and that quietness to us. Okay? And trust me, we're going to go through a lot of really cool stuff with the temple to prove that it represents the church resting. But even before that, just talking about Solomon as a representation of Christ right now, so that he would give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. And that is talking about actually our rest from works, which, like I said, will be plenty substantiated going forward. Just to explain something, though, it says that he also would be a man of rest. What does that mean, that Jesus would also be a man of rest, and that God would give Jesus rest from all his enemies round about? Well, again, Jesus is resting because he has defeated all his enemies. There are no more enemies to defeat anymore. Let's real quick go to Psalms 110, verse 1. Jesus has defeated all his enemies, and actually, because Jesus has defeated all his enemies entirely, God has told Jesus to sit down and rest now, because his work, as he said at the cross, is finished. And with a finished work, what is left when there is a finished work? Rest. In fact, Jesus' complacency, sitting there on the throne, is a proof to you that his work on your behalf is done, because he defeated all of his enemies. Now, I'll make a mention also in the second, too, that when it says that Jesus defeated his enemies, it's actually referring to your enemies. It just so happens that when someone's your enemy, he calls them his enemies, which is a really cool thing. But this is exactly what God, when it says that Jesus would be a man of rest, that he would rest and be given rest from all his enemies round about, this is confirmed about Jesus in verse 1 here, Psalms 110, verse 1. The Lord said unto my Lord, that means Yahweh said unto my Lord, referring to Jesus, or referring to God saying unto Jesus, sit. Sit, that's rest. Sit. The word sit, actually, or laying down, look at our glossary, reformedchurch.com/glossary, means rest. Sit thou at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool. That's really packed there. But the concept of making his enemies a footstool doesn't mean, this verse does not mean, Jesus, sit down until I defeat all your enemies. Making enemies a footstool is, and again, because I can't give you the biblical proof for this, you're going to have to maybe just ask me after service if you want to know this, but what that's actually talking about is, you've already defeated all your enemies. This is proven, just so you know, by Hebrews chapter 2. You've already defeated all your enemies, so sit down, take a load off now. All your enemies are defeated. Now let's sit back and wait for the manifestation and to see them actually having been put under your authority, or rather under your subjection. We don't yet see all these things subject to Jesus, but we do see Jesus, who was already crucified, who already suffered, and who was already perfected. We're just sort of waiting now for the manifestation of Jesus' victory that he already won. This, sit until I make your enemies a footstool basically just means you defeated them already. You made a display of them openly, as Colossians 2 says. You already triumphed over them through the cross. Now, sit down, take a load off. Now let's just see the manifestation of your enemies having been, put under your subjection. So that's what that means. But this verse is saying, though, this is essentially the fulfillment of what we just read about Solomon. He'd be a man of rest, and that God would give him rest from all his enemies. That simply means that Jesus would be able to rest because he has defeated all his enemies already. There's no more enemy to defeat. There's no more any foe to undertake and to fight against. The cool thing is, which I should have gotten the reference for you before service, but as far as why does it say Jesus' enemies? That he'd be given rest from his enemies. Well, the Bible actually calls, whenever, like in the Old Testament, the devil did something even against one of God's kids, God would say, they're my enemies. For instance, God told David that when David sinned with Bathsheba, God told David and said, you've given the enemies of the Lord an occasion to reproach you. Because back in the day, in David's day, the devil was allowed to go to heaven and accuse people before God. The devil was just the tattletale. That's what he did. He used God's justice against people under the law. He knew that God was just, and yet knew also that God was long-suffering and would even put off punishment to give people chances to repent and to receive Jesus. And mind you, I'm describing a condition under the law, not today. Okay, this is not what happens today. It's always important to mention. But with that said, though, God was just telling David that you've given them an opportunity to accuse you before me. Like, you sinned, and now they're over here telling me what you did and that, what they want done, and you gave them an occasion. But it's funny that they were against David, and God calls them his enemies. If you can throw it up there if you have it. If you don't have it, that's fine. But anyway, just so that everyone can see the reference. But it's just an awesome thing to see that when it refers to, my point is, when it refers to Jesus defeating his enemies or being given rest from his enemies, Jesus did not come or go to the cross to defeat enemies because he was threatened by something. You have to understand that, right? If he's saying that he was warring against his enemies or something, or God refers to Jesus defeating his enemies, think about that for a second. If Jesus defeated his enemies at the cross, what threat were they posing to him exactly? Right? I mean, Jesus was in glory with the Father. There was absolutely no threat to him whatsoever. The threat was to us. He didn't go to the cross to take his own sin or his own death. Those were ours, right? Those were characteristics of us. So anyhow, with all that said, I'm going to move on though. So that's what it means when it says that Solomon is a man of rest and that God would give Solomon rest from his enemies. And therefore, what happens if Jesus is a man of rest and has come and conquered all of our enemies? What does that mean for us? If he has really finished the work and there's not even any more foe, including death itself, we are not waiting, just so you know, in misinterpretations of the Bible, Jesus is not coming back in the second coming to defeat death. That is not what he did that at the cross. And if Jesus has no more foe of yours to defeat, including any demonic thing or any worldly thing, any problem you could ever go through, Jesus defeated all of your problems. I'm talking about your real problems, right? The stuff that you think about and or have worried about unnecessarily in the past. Those ones, right? Those problems. If Jesus really defeated all of it, and it's really, really done, and he's really so finished that he's sitting now, and the Father said, good job, thumbs up, sit down now, you defeated all their enemies, which he calls his enemies. What does that mean for us? Well, then no wonder it says that Solomon would give us, our Solomon, would give us peace and quietness in his days. Because if he's resting from his work for us, then that's why we get to rest as well. Because he finished all that work on our behalf, right? All right. Let's see. Let's go to... mind you, just keep in mind as we go through this as well, Solomon means peace. So not only was it prophesied that he would give, that Jesus, our greater Solomon, would give us rest and peace in his days, which we live in that fulfillment, but his name is peace, which means that, because names matter, right? Even in Hebrews 7, he mentions Melchizedek's name and the meaning of it, showing that God writes names down for a reason. And if God has Solomon as a picture of Jesus, and Solomon's name is peace, that means Jesus' name is peace. His name to you, God's label on Jesus, that he puts on Jesus on your behalf, is your peace, your quietness, your rest from works. Right? That's why Jesus said, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Most churches invite people to get saved and come to Jesus to live for him and devote their life to him and make Jesus Lord of their life, to submit their life to him and live differently now. It's literally the opposite of what Jesus said. He said, if you're working, come to me and I'll give you rest. And meanwhile, we'll have altar calls inviting people to work. I understand we don't say work, we say live for Jesus. But that's work, right? You living is work. Jesus has actually invited you to be transformed by his Spirit and for him to live through you so that you don't have to live anymore, Galatians 2:20. That's God's invitation to you. God's invitation is not come and work for me, unless you're talking about faith, that is, John chapter 6. That is the only work of God, that you believe. But God's not calling you to come and work for him. God's calling you to come and rest from your works. That's the purpose of Jesus, our Solomon, our peace, giving us peace and quietness. You can also see this in Isaiah 9. Isaiah 9:6. It says, for unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. This is referring to Jesus. This is actually a prophecy of Jesus. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, which that right there should show you even his relationship to the Solomon symbolism, Prince of Peace, right there. Of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. There will be no end to the peace that Jesus gives us, or his reign. And it says, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice, from henceforth even forever. That's literally what was just prophesied of Solomon. That David would have a son, and he would build God a house, and his throne would be forever. And this is referring clearly to Christ. Everybody agrees on that. This is referring to Christ. Probably even Jewish people agree that this is referring to the Christ. And it says that the Christ would be upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, because in other words, that Jesus is king, and therefore because he's king and came in the lineage of David, that's what's being referred to here. Upon the throne of David, upon his kingdom, it says to order it to establish it with judgment and justice from henceforth even forever. Again, another thing that it said about Solomon, that he would take the throne of David and would have that forever. And this is the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So you just see, again, a confirmation there about Jesus and his relationship to Solomon. Upon the throne of David, Jesus, the son of David. Even as you read the New Testament, you'll hear people call Jesus the son of David. And that's why. Which obviously is what? That's what Solomon was, right? Solomon was the son of David. Jesus was just a son, a few generations removed. I won't read this to you. Even in Genesis 49:10, Jesus is referred to by a name Shiloh, and the word Shiloh means like tranquil. Okay, just in case you're interested to read that. And as I said before, if you want to see the whole Jesus son of David thing, Matthew chapter 1 talks about Jesus' genealogy, and also Luke chapter 3. All right, let's go to Matthew 12 now. This is a really cool verse that, man, I'll show you some translational stuff here that is a little bit strange to me. But Matthew 12:41, still King James, it says that the men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonas. Now, Jonas, this is not talking about like the Jonas brothers or something. This is another word for Jonah, okay? I don't know why. When you translate it from Greek, it translates differently in certain translations. So this is referring to Jonah. And it's saying that Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, a greater than Jonas, or Jonah, is here. Now, the thing that I find a little strange here with translations, and it could be, my point remains the same regardless of the translation, but I believe this is translated wrong, because I can't find, like, you see how it says a greater than Jonah is here? I can't find that's actually two words. It's translated as two words, greater than, but that, when I look in a Strong's Bible, that's one word, meaning greater. So, in my opinion, again, if there's something I'm not understanding, that's fine, but I don't think I'm missing anything here. I don't believe that should be translated a greater than Jonah. I believe it should be translated a greater Jonah. Because Jesus is, in other words, regardless of even the translation, that is what he's saying. That I'm positive about. Jesus is referring to himself as not just that he's greater than Jonah, but a greater Jonah. Like, that's who he is. And the reason why he's saying that is because we've been through also in the past the whole Jonah story. And Jonah represents very clearly Jesus and what he was coming to do. Just the way that Jonah went to the men of Tarshish, but the men that Jonah came to threw him into the sea. But then after spending 3 days and 3 nights in the sea, he was spit up back on dry land, and he went to a different people than the people he went to before. And those people in Nineveh that he went to that were considered sinners actually repented and received the Lord. And in the same way, Jesus went to a particular people. Not the men of Tarshish, he went to his brethren, the Jews. But the Jews threw him into the sea, because the sea is a word for the underworld, hell, right? The Jews threw him into the sea, right, by killing him. And he spent 3 days in the sea. That's what Jesus did. But after 3 days, Jesus rose from the sea and was spit back out on the earth, on dry land. And instead of going back to the men of Tarshish, the Jews, he instead went to a different people who were considered sinners, the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are actually the one that have received Jesus. And this is the fulfillment of prophecy today. It is, who is it that believes on this Jewish Messiah predominantly that came 2,000 years ago? A Jewish Messiah came to the Jews. This is historically accurate. Even people that don't believe in the Bible believe that Jesus was a real person. A Jewish person came claiming to be the Messiah to the Jews, and who is it that predominantly doesn't believe on him? The Jews. By religion, if you are a religious Jew, typically you do not obviously believe in Jesus being the Messiah, but predominantly we would call it Christianity. Where's Christianity predominant? It's all over the world, but it's just not really prevalent amongst the Jews. It's prevalent amongst the Gentiles, and that's what that whole story represents. That's why Jonah went to a different people after his resurrection, the same way that the gospel was only spoken to the Gentiles after Jesus' resurrection. Even when Jesus came at first, he didn't come to the Gentiles, but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so Jesus is the greater Jonah. He's the greater Jonah that really spent the 3 days in the sea and really rose up from the sea and really went to a different people than he came to initially. He's the greater Jonah. Jonah is a symbol of Jesus. Furthermore, if you keep reading in verse 42, it says, the queen of the south shall rise in the judgment with this generation and shall condemn it, for she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. Again, I don't think this should be translated a greater than Solomon. A greater Solomon is here. I will probably go through a timeline at some point in the series, but when he refers to the Queen of Sheba even coming to Solomon, that will be part of that timeline. But again, in that timeline, for those that have heard the nations that are saved messages, I'll give you a little sort of clue here. Solomon finishes building the temple, and after he's finishing building the temple, we know, right, what happens when the temple is finished building, right? Jesus comes back. And if you've heard the nations that are saved messages, after Solomon is done building the temple, there are people that come and bring Solomon gold and silver as tribute. So I'll just throw that out at you. If you don't understand that, that's fine. But there's a timeline where Solomon, again, is representing Jesus, which is actually Jesus referring to here, about how the Queen of Sheba came to hear the wisdom of Solomon and brought him silver and gold and stuff. And he says, I'm the greater Solomon. Solomon is a picture of Jesus as not only the builder of the temple, but the one that builds a temple at rest. That right there is the temple that Solomon built. A bride lying down and resting. A bride that we'll go over is receiving fruitfulness, not producing fruitfulness. A bride that gets to feed on what Jesus provided her, not provide anything or do anything for Jesus because she's completely bankrupt of herself and has need that Jesus had done something for her. You see, Solomon built a temple that looks like a person laying down. He's the builder and representing Christ to build a church that is not doing anything for him or neither required to do anything for him, but to simply believe what he's done for her. That's what Solomon represents, and that's why God prophesies about Solomon, really speaking about Jesus, saying he's going to be a man of rest. In fact, I'm going to call him Peace. His name, people say, that's my middle name. That's Jesus' first name, Peace, your peace. He's called Peace. The importance of a name is this. A name is a label, right? So the reason why God gives Jesus different names is because he's just labeling him. What is he, right? Like you can have Miss Kim has all her spices with labels on them, right? So that's cinnamon. Why does she do that? So she knows the contents, right? God puts labels on Jesus and on you as well. This is, for instance, why even Jesus often changed his disciples' names in certain areas, because this is actually a better label for you. Let's put this label on you. Like Pastor Jose's actual first real name is Yuri, which I like that label too because it's a space name, because he was actually named after a cosmonaut, which is kind of a cool thing, going to space. If you've been around the church for a while, you kind of understand this space concept is pretty cool. So there's a label. God will slap a label on you and say, this is who you are. And so when God says, you know what? This guy is going to he's going to build a temple to represent my son, who's going to build a resting temple. And I'm going to call him Peace. You should call him Solomon, Peace. It's because he's labeling Christ, saying he's your peace, he's your quietness, he's your rest. Only confirmed by the fact that the temple he built is resting. The recipient of the peace that Jesus is to us. And again, Jesus saying that he is the greater Solomon, the greater Peace. I won't go into this. Well, I say I won't go into this. Let's see how much time I got. I don't have very much time. So let's see where I go from here. All right. Let's do it real quick. Song of Solomon 1:7. Now, no surprise, we will go over this further as well, but Song of Solomon, if it's a Song of Solomon, it's really talking about the Song of Jesus, really. Because Solomon, again, Jesus is the greater Solomon. Solomon represents Jesus, and the Song of Solomon is actually a dialogue, a song, but a dialogue between Jesus and his temple, Jesus and his church, Jesus and us. It accounts for how we got saved, because it accounts for the marriage of the bride. It accounts for the resurrection. It accounts for all the stuff that we've talked about in the nations that are saved. It's a huge timeline. We'll go over the whole thing. But it's important to note, though, again, the woman is the church, but the way that Solomon even describes his bride in Song of Solomon is with like the various artifacts of the temple. It's literally Solomon talking to his temple, or AKA Jesus talking to the church. Song of Solomon actually is a huge part of what the Lord has used to confirm the fact that, yes, indeed, this part of the temple must have looked like that because Song of Solomon describes it like that. Okay? But you can see even before the bride like technically gets saved in the book, in chapter 1, it says, "Tell me, O thou whom my soul loves," because that is how you love God, right? Right? You know that? How does the bride love her husband? With her soul, right? You don't have to love Jesus with your life. You love God with your soul. That's how he commanded us to love him, right? Love him with your heart. Love him with your soul. Oh, you whom my soul loves. God doesn't want to be Lord of your life. He wants to be Lord of your mind. Because he hasn't asked you for your living for him. He's going to live through you. No longer you that live. He's asking you for your belief in him. This life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. So he says, "Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where you feed and where you make your flock to rest." Solomon is referred to as a person that makes his flock to rest in the book. Again, just another confirmation of him as the role of Christ. He is our source of rest, our source of peace, as he was prophesied in, what was that, 2 Chronicles or 1 Chronicles before. All right, let's show you one more example here. I'm going to end up in Genesis 5, so you can get that cued, but Genesis 5. To show you one more parallel before we leave. This concept, just to further, I want to cement that Jesus really, or rather Solomon is really symbolic of Jesus. And not that Solomon is just a symbol of Jesus, who's the builder of the temple, right? So just to rehash, in the beginning of this message, we said Jesus was the builder of the house, right? In the book of Hebrews. I think that was chapter 3. But Jesus, the builder of the house. Then I showed you a few things about Zerubbabel and Joshua being builders who also represent Jesus, another confirmation that Jesus is the builder. Then Solomon, how Solomon is the builder of the temple, and how Jesus said, "I am the greater Solomon," not to mention the fact that Solomon is described as the son of David, whose throne will be forever. Then it was prophesied about Jesus in Isaiah that, he'd be upon the throne of David, and his reign would be forever, right? And he'd be the Prince of Peace, right? All these things to show you that's what it's symbolic of. Furthermore, to show you another parallel, Noah is also symbolic of Jesus. Now, we have the Noah timelines on our website. So if you want to hear the whole timeline of how Noah is a picture of Jesus, just type Noah timeline in our search on our website, and you'll get that. Okay? So I'm not going to go through that right now. But just to give you a little summary, Noah is a picture of Jesus as well. And guess what? You know what Noah was? A builder. He was a builder, not of a temple, but of an ark, right? That ark, the Bible says, had many nests in it. Look at Genesis, actually, not Genesis 5, but actually I think it's Genesis 6. I didn't even write this down correctly, but Genesis 6, verse 14. God commands Noah to build an ark, the same way that Solomon was commanded to build a temple. And when Noah is commanded to build the ark in Genesis, I said at 6:14, it says, "Make you an ark of gopher wood, and rooms shall you make in the ark, and shall pitch it within and without with pitch." There's a lot I can say about that. But notice that he says, you're going to build one ark, but it's going to have rooms in the ark. The word room there means a nest or a chamber or a dwelling. This is how Jesus described his Father's house, that there's many different dwellings in one house. Trust me, there's a lot more substantiation in the Noah timelines that this is true than what I'm giving you right now. But so you already see Noah is the builder of this ark, which the word ark actually in the Bible doesn't mean boat. It means box, is actually what it means. He's the builder of this box and with many rooms in it, many dwellings in it. Now look at Genesis 5:28. Before Noah, the builder, was even born, when he was born, I believe. Yeah, when he was born, Genesis 5:28, and Lamech, that's Noah's dad, lived 182 years and begat a son. He gave birth to, or obviously with some help, a son, and he called his name Noah. You know what Noah means? Rest. Solomon, the builder of the temple, his name is peace. because he's building a temple. He's adding people to a temple, inviting them to come and rest. Jesus' invite to you is not to come and work. He's adding people to a temple that he's giving rest. And so Noah the builder's name is rest, just the way that Solomon the builder's name is peace. And it's in his name shall be Noah, saying, this same shall comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands. It's not an invite to you to come and work and toil with your hands. We say, people say, I'm the hands and feet of Jesus. That is absolutely true. This is his body. But it's not, like when we say we're his body, that doesn't mean your hands work for him. That means he works through your hands. You not living anymore. You resting. This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. That's a whole other cool thing. He's talking about our flesh there, that he would give us rest from the works of our flesh. But Noah the builder is said to give rest to us from the work and toil of our hands. Now that's a weird thing to say about Noah, but it's not weird to say if he's symbolic of Jesus, which he is. And no wonder, pretty much the last thing I believe that I need to read you, Genesis 8:4, in closing, Noah, or let's call him our rest, builds an ark, a box, with many rooms in it. And when Noah, builds an ark, what happens to the ark? When he adds people to the ark, what happens to the ark? Genesis 8:4, and the ark rested. The reason why God says rested is because the ark is a symbol, the same way the temple is, of the body of Christ that contains many of us, all of us. We're individual dwelling places for God that he chose to marry you and come on the inside of you to live in you forever, because he wanted your companionship and he wanted to give everything to you and share everything with you. And when he did that, you were added to his ark. You became a room for him, a chamber for him in his ark. And when Solomon adds a stone to his temple, he's adding that stone to come and rest. That's why it's the temple laying down. And when Noah adds someone to his ark, or builds a room in his ark, what's he doing that for? To rest the ark. The ark rests. Now, Lamech said that Noah would give us rest from the work and toil of our hands, but the Bible never accounts for anything like that happening. There's not like a point where like Noah tells someone, no, it's okay, I'll do that for you, or something. Like it's sort of just said, and then you read the account and you're like, okay, flood came, killed everybody. You're wondering like where was that prophecy ever fulfilled? But this is he's an antitype of Christ, and the rest that Jesus gives us is symbolized in the fact that the ark that Noah built rested upon the mountains. Upon the mountains is not even something I'm going to get into right now, but most of us know that. So all in all, you can see all these different parallels. Noah is the perfect parallel to Solomon, both representing Christ. One's called rest, one's called peace. They're both builders. They both built something. And in the thing that they built, they made the thing that they built rest. Solomon makes his temple rest, and Noah made his ark rest, symbolically, obviously. It's a very cool thing. Jesus' invite to us, again, is you want to be a part of my house? Then you're going to come and rest. That's how the church, mind you, in everything that we're saying so far, bear in mind in the first part, I said that the temple was a picture of how the church ought to conduct itself. So if you're getting already a clue of what that conduct means, or lack of it, it's a very cool thing. I'm not going to read this to you because I am done right now. But if you want to read Isaiah 32 on your own time, read it in the New American Standard Bible when you come to verse 18. But that's a prophecy of Jesus and how when he sent his Spirit, when the Spirit of God was poured out from on high, that we would dwell in a peaceful and quiet habitation. That Jesus would give peace and quietness. Man, how do I not read that now, right? But I'll explain it to you. It is verse 18. Isaiah 32, verse 18 in the New American Standard Bible. Isaiah 32, 18. That Jesus would give us peace and quietness. Sounds like what was prophesied about Solomon, right? Peace and quietness to what? To our house, to our habitation. Our habitation would rest because Jesus sent his Spirit to live through us now. It's the fulfillment of God telling Solomon, son of David, you're going to build for me a house, and you're going to give peace and quietness to Israel in your days. And that's what you see there, right? They would dwell in a peaceable habitation and in sure dwellings, that's our faith, and in quiet resting places.
We hope you enjoyed this message from Reformed Church. If you have, please share this with someone else and help us get this uncommon truth out to the world. If you'd like to support this good news, you can do so at reformedchurch.com/give. Also on our website, you can take advantage of our free messages, articles, and even full discipleship courses. Start reforming your mind now at reformedchurch.com.